Imagine being stranded in the snow, the bitter cold cutting into your bones, the wind howling through endless mountains. Your food is gone. Your children are starving, and as the days turn into weeks, there is only one unthinkable choice left: survive by consuming the flesh of the dead. This is the story of the Donner Party, one of the darkest and most infamous tales of American history. In the spring of 1846, a group of pioneers, led by George and Jacob Donner, set out for California, chasing dreams of a better life. They were families, full of hope, traveling in wagon trains across the vast American West. But they made a fateful decision: to take an unproven shortcut called the Hastings Cutoff. This shortcut promised to save them time. Instead led them into a nightmare of treacherous terrain and brutal delays. By the time they reached the Sierra Nevada mountains, it was too late. Early heavy snowfalls trapped them, turning their dream into a frozen prison. The winter that followed was one of the harshest on record. Their supplies dwindled rapidly. Oxen, the very animals that pulled their wagons, became their first source of food. Then their pets, then boiled hides, twigs, anything to quell the gnawing hunger. But it wasn't enough. Starvation and sickness began to claim lives, one by one. The survivors, surrounded by the bodies of their loved ones, faced a horrifying dilemma. To live, they had to do the unthinkable. This desperate act of survival would forever seal their legacy in the darkest pages of pioneer history. Of the 87 members of the Donner Party trapped in the mountains, only 48 would survive to see California. Their rescue came in stages, with brave relief parties fighting through the snow to reach them. The stories they brought back were tales of unimaginable suffering, but also of incredible resilience and the sheer, desperate will to live. The Donner Party story isn't just a grim tale of survival. It's a powerful and deeply human reminder of what people are capable of when pushed to the absolute edge. What do you think? Could you have survived? Let me know your thoughts in the comments below. And if you find these stories of history as fascinating as I do, make sure to hit that subscribe button and ring the bell so you do unmiss our next journey into the past. Thanks for watching. Imagine it's the spring of 1846. The air in America is buzzing with a powerful idea, a belief called manifest destiny. It's the conviction that the United States is destined, even divinely ordained, to stretch from the Atlantic to the Pacific. For thousands of ordinary families, this wasn't just a political slogan. It was a personal invitation, a promise of a new life, a golden opportunity shimmering on the western horizon. In the bustling towns of Springfield, Illinois, and across the river in Missouri, wagons are being loaded. Families are selling off possessions, packing heirlooms, and saying their goodbyes. The talk is of one place: California. It's painted as a paradise, a land of perpetual sunshine, fertile soil, and boundless opportunity. A place where a hard-working family could finally build a real future. Among the many souls stirred by this dream are two brothers, George and Jacob Donner. They are prosperous, respected farmers from Illinois, men well into their 60s. Why would they risk everything, uprooting their large, comfortable families for a grueling 2,000-mile journey? Because the promise was just that intoxicating. They weren't just moving, they were leading. Their confidence and preparations inspired others to join them. Another key figure emerges: James Reed, a successful businessman and a friend of Abraham Lincoln. He builds a wagon that's a marvel of its time. A 2-story palace car, complete with a stove and spring-cushioned seats. It's a symbol of the group's optimism. They aren't preparing for a disaster. They're planning for a grand, triumphant arrival in their new home. They see themselves not as refugees, but as founders of a new American dream on the Pacific coast. So, in April 1846, a train of about 30 wagons, carrying nearly 90 men, women, and children, rolls out from Springfield. They are a collection of farmers, businessmen, and hopeful families. They are full of grit, optimism, and the pioneering spirit of the age. They look west, their faces lit with the hope of a brighter future in California. At this moment, they are the very embodiment of manifest destiny. The journey ahead is long and unknown, but their hearts are filled with courage and the belief that they are heading towards a better life. This isn't just a group of travelers. This is the beginning of the Donner Party. They believe the biggest challenges are behind them, But the true test, the one that will etch their name into history, is waiting just over the next mountain range. Ever heard the saying, a shortcut is often a wrong cut? Well, for one group of pioneers, this wasn't just a saying. It was a devastating reality. This is the story of the Donner Party and the one decision that sealed their fate. Imagine it's 1846. You've sold everything you own, packed your life into a wagon, and you're heading west to California, the land of sunshine and opportunity. The journey is long, over 2,000 miles, and it's fraught with danger. You're part of a large wagon train, rolling along the well-trodden Oregon Trail. Things are going smoothly, but you're tired. The journey feels endless. Then, you hear about a new route, a shortcut. A man named Lansford Hastings has written a guidebook, The Emigrant's Guide to Oregon and California. In it, he promotes a new trail, the Hastings Cutoff, promising to shave 300 miles off the journey. 300 miles, that's weeks of travel, less time on the trail, and a quicker start to your new life. For a group of families, including those led by George Donner and James Reed, this sounded like a dream come true. They reached the fork in the road at the Little Sandy River in what is now Wyoming. The main trail veered north. The Hastings Cutoff went south. Most of the wagon trains stuck to the proven path, but the Donner and Reed families, along with several others, decided to gamble. They put their faith in Hastings' book and turned their wagons south. This was their point of no return. What the guidebook didn't mention was that Hastings himself had never actually traveled this route with wagons. He promised a smooth, flat journey. The reality was a nightmare. Their first major obstacle was the Wasatch Mountains in Utah. Hastings had claimed it would take a week to cross. It took them over a month. There was no trail. The men had to chop down trees and clear a path, inch by painstaking inch, through dense forest and treacherous canyons. Their wagons were battered, their oxen were exhausted, and precious time was slipping away. Every day spent hacking through the mountains was a day they were UN crossing the desert that lay ahead. Their supplies dwindled, and morale plummeted. They were falling further and further behind schedule. After finally breaking free from the mountains, they faced their next ordeal. The Great Salt Lake Desert. Hastings had described an easy, 40-mile crossing that would take 2 days. He was wrong. Again, it was an 80-mile-wide wasteland of salt flats, with no water and no grass for their animals. The sun was relentless. The salt crust cracked under the weight of the wagons, which sank into the sticky mud below. Wagons had to be abandoned. Dozens of their precious oxen, their engines for the journey, perished from thirst and exhaustion. The families were forced to walk, their water barrels empty, under a blazing sun. They staggered out of the desert, broken and demoralized. The so-called shortcut had cost them a full month, and a huge portion of their resources. This catastrophic delay was the direct cause of their ultimate tragedy. By the time they reached the Sierra Nevada mountains, it was late October. The shortcut had put them so far behind schedule that they were caught by an early, massive snowstorm. Trapped just miles from the summit, with no way forward and no way back, their fate was sealed. The dream of California became a winter of desperation. All because they took a shortcut that was anything but. It's a chilling reminder that sometimes the tested path is the best path. Thank you so much for watching. If you found this story fascinating, please hit that like button and subscribe for more tales from history. See you next time. Have you ever heard the saying, don't take shortcuts? Well, for one group of pioneers in 1846, that advice would have been life-saving. This is the story of the Donner Party. A tale that starts with dreams of California sunshine but takes a dark, chilling turn. Our story begins with a group of families, including the Donners and the Reeds, heading west. They were full of hope, looking for a new life. But they made a fateful decision to take a new, unproven route, called the Hastings Cutoff. It was advertised as a shortcut that would shave weeks off their journey. Sounds great, right? Wrong. The shortcut turned out to be a nightmare. The trail was barely a trail at all. They had to carve their own path through dense forests and brutal, waterless deserts. The heavy wagons, packed with all their worldly possessions, began to break down. Axles snapped, wheels shattered. The journey, which was supposed to be faster, slowed to a crawl. Imagine the frustration, watching your supplies dwindle day by day, with no end in sight. To make matters worse, their livestock, the very animals they depended on for food and to pull their wagons, started to die. Thirst and exhaustion claimed cattle, one by one. Each loss was a devastating blow, not just to their resources, but to their morale. The dream of a prosperous life in California was fading, replaced by the grim reality of survival. The mood within the group began to sour. With resources stretched thin and tempers flaring, the once cooperative group started to fracture. People who were once friendly neighbors became suspicious rivals. Arguments broke out over trivial things, fueled by hunger, fear, and exhaustion. The group's leaders, George Donner and James Reed, who were once close friends, found themselves at odds. Disagreements over the best way to proceed created deep divisions. Should they push on? Should they rest? Who was to blame for their predicament? The pressure was immense, and the leadership began to crumble. Just when they needed it most, this growing tension was a ticking time bomb, and it was about to explode. The breaking point came during a difficult ascent up a sandy hill. Tempers flared between James Reed and another man, John Snyder. The argument escalated into a physical fight, and in the chaos, Red tragically stabbed Snyder, who died from the wound. The camp was thrown into turmoil. Some demanded instant justice, calling for Reed to be hanged. Others argued it was self-defense. After a tense trial, a compromise was reached. James Reed would not be executed, but he would be banished. Forced to leave his wife and children behind, he rode off alone into the wilderness, with no food or supplies. It was a brutal punishment, essentially a death sentence. The group had lost another leader, and the Reed family was left vulnerable and heartbroken. The party was more broken and desperate than ever before. As Reed rode away, the remaining travelers pressed onward, unaware that their greatest test was still to come. The snows of the Sierra Nevada mountains were just ahead, and winter was closing in fast. Their so-called shortcut had led them directly into a trap from which many would never escape. Imagine this. You've sold everything, packed your life into a wagon, and traveled for months across a rugged continent. Your destination, the golden promise of California. For the Donner Party, that dream was just within reach. By October 1846, they stood at the foot of the Sierra Nevada mountains, the final barrier. They were exhausted, but hopeful. The promised land was just over the peaks. But the mountains had other plans. Winter arrived early that year, with a fury no one could have predicted. Vicious snowstorms, one after another, slammed into the Sierras, dumping feet of snow in a matter of hours. The passes, their gateway to safety, became impassable walls of white. The Donner Party was trapped. Panic must have set in. They were stranded, with no way forward and no way back. Their only option was to wait out the winter. They hastily built makeshift cabins near what is now known as Donner Lake, using whatever materials they could find. Logs, hides, and pieces of their wagons were pieced together to create crude shelters against the biting wind and relentless cold. Families huddled together, trying to keep warm as the snow piled higher and higher, eventually burying their cabins completely, turning their world into a landscape of white mounds. Inside these dark, cramped spaces, hope began to fade as quickly as their supplies. The food they had meticulously rationed for the final leg of their journey was disappearing at an alarming rate. The men, desperate, would venture out into the blinding snow to hunt. They'd spend days searching, but the wildlife had either fled the harsh weather or was buried too deep to find. They would return empty-handed, the looks on their faces saying more than words ever could. The gnawing ache of hunger became a constant companion for every man, woman, and child. As weeks turned into months, the situation grew dire. The last of the oxen were consumed. Then the family pets. They boiled hides and bones, trying to extract any last bit of nourishment. But it wasn't enough. The biting cold was relentless, and the hunger was a torment that overshadowed everything. Starvation, the most primal of fears, became their reality. The dream of California had transformed into a living nightmare, a desperate struggle for survival against the unforgiving power of nature. In the silent frozen wilderness, The bonds of family and humanity would be tested in ways they could never have imagined. The choices they faced would haunt American history for generations to come. Today, we're delving into one of the most harrowing chapters of American westward expansion, a story of desperation, survival, and the unthinkable choices people make when faced with certain death. We're talking about the final, desperate days of the Donner Party. Imagine this. You're trapped in the Sierra Nevada mountains, buried under 20 feet of snow. The year is 1846. Your soup-place, which you thought would last the journey to California, ran out weeks ago. The silence of the vast, frozen wilderness is broken only by the gnawing ache of starvation. This was the grim reality for the men, women, and children of the Donner Party. They were pioneers, full of hope for a new life, now caught in a frozen nightmare. Their initial attempts to survive were acts of pure desperation. They boiled the leather hides from their wagon roofs, turning them into a foul, glue-like jelly, just to have something in their stomachs. They gnawed on boiled bones, chewed on leather shoelaces, and stripped the bark and twigs from the few trees that weren't completely buried. Every scrap of organic matter was a potential meal. Their pack animals were long gone, and even their beloved pet dogs had been sacrificed to the relentless hunger. But this grotesque diet provided little nourishment. People grew weaker by the day, their bodies wasting away as starvation and disease took hold. By mid-December, with no sign of a thaw and their numbers dwindling, a small group decided they couldn't just wait to die. They would attempt the impossible, cross a snow-covered mountain pass on foot to get help. This brave, or perhaps reckless, group became known as the Forlorn Hope. 15 of the strongest remaining members, 10 men and 5 women, fashioned crude snowshoes from oxbows and leather strips. They packed meager rations, barely enough for a week, and set out into the blinding white landscape, believing the journey to the nearest settlement would take just a few days. They were tragically wrong. The journey of the Forlorn Hope was a descent into hell. The snowshoes were clumsy, the terrain was brutal, and the biting cold was relentless. Within days, their tiny food supply was gone. Starvation returned with a vengeance, more potent than ever. Hallucinations and delirium set in. One by one, members of the group began to succumb to exhaustion and hypothermia, collapsing into the snow, never to rise again. The survivors huddled together for warmth, but they knew warmth alone wouldn't save them. And this is where the story takes its darkest turn. Faced with the choice of either perishing alongside their fallen comrades or doing the unimaginable, they made a pact. The living would have to consume the dead to survive. It's a moment that has forever defined the Donner Party tragedy. The decision was not made lightly. It was a heart-wrenching act born from the most primal instinct, the will to live. For over a month, this small band struggled on, their journey fueled by this grim necessity, their humanity tested to its absolute limit. Miraculously, after 33 agonizing days, 7 survivors from the Forlorn Hope, 2 men, and all 5 women stumbled into a Native American village, barely alive. They were walking skeletons, but they had made it. Their arrival set in motion a series of rescue efforts to save the dozens still trapped back at the camps. But for many, it was too late. The relief parties would arrive to scenes of unimaginable horror and despair. Of the 87 members of the Donner Party who entered the mountains, only 48 would survive. The story of the Forlorn Hope is a chilling testament to the extremes of human endurance and the terrible choices that survival can demand. It's a somber reminder of the unforgiving nature of the American frontier and the profound strength and fragility of the human spirit. Somber, historical-style music begins and fades to a background hum word of the stranded pioneers, trapped by an early and relentless winter, finally trickled out of the snow-choked Sierra Nevada mountains. By February 1847, 4 long months after the Donner Party became imprisoned, the first rescue mission was finally launched from Johnson's Ranch, near Sutter's Fort in California. The men called themselves the Forlorn Hope. They knew the journey would be perilous, but they couldn't imagine the scene that awaited them. These weren't seasoned mountaineers. They were ordinary men ranch hands, settlers, fathers spurred on by a sense of duty and humanity. They packed what supplies they could carry on their own backs, knowing that mules couldn't make it through the deep snowdrifts. Each step was a struggle, a battle against the biting wind and the crushing depth of the snow, which in some places was over 20 feet deep. They followed the faint trail left by the small group that had miraculously escaped on snowshoes weeks earlier. After a grueling trek, they reached Truckee Lake. What they found would haunt them for the rest of their lives. The scene wasn't one of a pioneer camp. It was a vision of a frozen hell. Crude, snow-covered shelters, barely more than hovels, were scattered among the pines. The air was heavy with an unnatural silence, broken only by the whistling wind and the faint, weak cries of the living. They called out, and figures began to emerge from the darkness of the cabin's skeletal, hollow-eyed specters who looked more dead than alive. Patrick Brayan, one of the few men still able to stand, staggered out to greet them, his voice a hoarse whisper. He asked, "Are you men from California, or do you come from heaven?" The rescuers were shaken to their core. All around them lay the frozen, unburied bodies of those who had already succumbed to starvation and cold. The rescuers distributed what little food they had, but it was a heart-wrenching task. They could only carry enough to get a small number of survivors out. They had to make an impossible choice: who was strong enough to attempt the journey back, and who had to be left behind to await the next rescue party. They chose 23 of the strongest, mostly children, to take with them. The parting was agonizing. Parents had to say goodbye to children, not knowing if they would ever see them again. The journey back was just as harrowing. Blizzards struck, and the starving survivors, weakened by months of deprivation, struggled with every step. Some couldn't make it. 2 of the Reed children were too weak to continue, and the rescuers had to leave them in the snow, promising to return. It was a brutal, desperate gamble. Over the next 2 months, 3 more relief parties would make the same treacherous journey. Each one arrived to find fewer survivors and more evidence of the unspeakable choices the pioneers had made to stay alive. The rescuers found pots containing boiled hides and charred bones. The survivors themselves were deeply traumatized, reluctant to speak of the horrors they had endured. The truth of what happened in those final, desperate weeks would only emerge slowly in hushed whispers and fragmented accounts. These rescue missions were acts of incredible bravery. The men who risked their own lives to save the Donner Party weren't seeking glory. They were driven by a fundamental compassion for their fellow human beings. They faced the worst of nature and the darkest aspects of human survival, bringing back not just survivors, but a story that would become a chilling and enduring part of American history. Imagine being so hungry, so utterly desperate, that the most fundamental rules of society begin to crumble. This isn't a horror movie plot. It's a chilling chapter from human history, a story of survival at its most extreme. Today, we're delving into a topic that is as grim as it is profound, one that forces us to ask, what would we do to stay alive? We're going to look at a time and place where the world turned upside down. Historical records, long-buried documents, and even the earth itself tell a harrowing tale. Archaeologists have found evidence, while diaries and letters written by those who lived through it paint a picture so vivid it is hard to bear. These aren't just stories. They are confessions and eyewitness accounts of ordinary people pushed beyond every imaginable limit. The most shocking testimonies come from the survivors themselves, in hushed tones and with words heavy with grief. Some admitted to the unthinkable. They had consumed human flesh to fend off starvation. Think about that for a moment. The desperation had to be absolute, a constant, gnawing void that silenced every moral compass. It was a choice between a certain, slow death and an act that would haunt them for the rest of their lives. These weren't monsters. They were parents, siblings, and neighbors, caught in a nightmare they couldn't wake up from. Yet, even in this abyss of despair, a sliver of humanity endured. The accounts consistently show that a final taboo remained. Protecting the children, adults would go to extraordinary lengths to shield the youngest from this horrific reality. They were the last hope, the symbol of a future that seemed to be slipping away. Parents would starve themselves to give their children the last crumbs of food, and communities would instinctively guard the little ones, even as their own bodies wasted away. This desperate, instinctual protection of the innocent is a powerful testament to the resilience of the human spirit. Even when faced with the ultimate horror, this grim chapter of history teaches us about the fragility of civilization and the incredible strength of the human will to survive. It is a stark reminder of what people can endure and the lines they might cross when all hope seems lost. It also shows us that even in the darkest of times, the instinct to protect the next generation can burn brighter than the desperation itself. It's a complex, difficult story, but one we must remember to truly understand the full spectrum of human experience. Video begins, perhaps with somber, historical-style music that fades into the background. Visuals could show artistic renderings of the survivors, newspaper clippings, and the Sierra Nevada mountains. In a winner, hello, history enthusiasts, and welcome back to the channel. Today, we're re-delving into the haunting aftermath of one of America's most infamous pioneer stories, the Donner Party. We often focus on the harrowing journey itself, but what happened to those who made it out alive? The story doesn't end with their rescue. When the first relief party finally reached the snowbound camps in February 1847, it was the beginning of the end of a nightmare. But for the survivors, a different kind of struggle was just beginning. Of the original 87 members of the Donner Party, only 48 survived the ordeal. These men, women, and children emerged from the mountains physically and emotionally scarred, carrying with them memories that would haunt them for the rest of their lives. Imagine being one of them. You've just survived starvation, extreme cold, and the loss of family and friends in the most horrific circumstances imaginable. You'd think the world would embrace you with sympathy. But that wasn't the case. As news of what had happened in the mountains spread across the nation, it was sensationalized by newspapers. The survivors weren't always seen as heroes who had endured the unthinkable. Instead, they were often viewed with a morbid curiosity, suspicion, and even outright disgust. The word cannibalism became a stain that was impossible to wash away. Survivors were forever linked to this taboo. Many of them tried to rebuild their lives in California, but the shadow of the Sierra Nevada followed them everywhere. They were whispered about in town. Children were taunted in school. Some survivors refused to ever speak of their experience, burying the trauma deep inside. Others felt compelled to defend their actions, writing letters and giving interviews to try and explain the impossible choices they had faced. Take the Reed family, for example. James Reed, who had been banished from the party earlier, returned as a rescuer. His family survived, but the memories were a heavy burden. His young daughter, Patty Reed, famously carried a small doll with her throughout the ordeal. That doll, now in a museum, is a poignant symbol of the innocence that was lost in those mountains. The survivors were forced to live with a dual identity. They were pioneers who had helped settle California, but they were also the Donner Party. The story became a national cautionary tale. It was a dark legend that both fascinated and repelled the American public. Books and articles painted grim pictures, often embellishing the facts for dramatic effect. The name Donner Pass itself became synonymous with tragedy and desperation. This brings us to the profound moral questions that the Donner Party forces us to confront. It's easy for us, from the comfort of our homes, to judge their actions. But what would any of us have done in that situation? When faced with certain death, when watching your own children starve, what lines would you be willing to cross to survive? It is a deeply unsettling question that strips away the veneer of civilization and exposes the raw instinct for survival that lies within us all. The legacy of the Donner Party is not just a story of suffering, but a complex testament to human endurance, the fragility of life, and the impossible moral choices that can arise from desperation. The survivors lived with the consequences of those choices every single day. Their story reminds us to approach history not just with curiosity, but with empathy. Have you ever heard of the Donner Party? It's a name that sends a shiver down the spine. A true story from American history that's become a legend of survival against impossible odds. But what really happened up there in the snow-covered Sierra Nevada mountains? Let's journey back to 1846. A group of families, full of hope and dreaming of a new life in California, set out on the Oregon Trail. They were the Donners, the Reeds, the Murphys, and others, nearly 90 people in total. Early on, they made a critical decision. Instead of sticking to the known, safe route, they opted for a supposed shortcut, the Hastings Cutoff. This single choice would seal their fate. The shortcut was anything but. It was a brutal, uncharted path that cost them precious time, energy, and supplies. They lost wagons, livestock, and most importantly, the race against winter. By the time they reached the Sierra Nevada, the mountains that stood between them and their destination. It was already late October. And then the snow began to fall, and it didn't stop. They were trapped. The pass, which we now call Donna Pass, became their prison. The snow piled up, burying their cabins and their hopes. They built crude shelters near what is now known as Donner Lake, a beautiful, serene place today that holds a dark secret. As the weeks turned into months, their food ran out. They ate their pack animals, their leather hides, even boiled bones for a thin, watery broth. Faced with starvation, the survivors were forced to make the most harrowing choice imaginable to stay alive. The story of what they endured is a chilling reminder of how fragile civilization can be when pushed to the absolute limit. It's this stark, human element that has fascinated us for generations. Why are we so drawn to these tales of extreme survival? Perhaps it's because they force us to ask ourselves, what would I do? Rescue parties eventually broke through the snows in February of 1847, but it was too late for many. Of the original group, only about half survived the ordeal. Their story isn't just a grim piece of history. It's a profound cautionary tale about the dangers of hubris, the consequences of poor decisions, and the incredible, sometimes terrifying, strength of the human will to live. Today, you can visit Donner Memorial State Park. You can stand by the placid waters of Donner Lake, look up at the towering mountains, and try to imagine the desperation felt by those trapped here so long ago. It's a somber, beautiful place that honors not just the tragedy, but the unbreakable spirit of those who endured it. The story of the Donner Party reminds us that the line between hope and despair can be as thin as a single snowflake. But the drive to survive is one of the most powerful forces in the universe. Picture this, 1846. America is buzzing with dreams of manifest destiny. The West is calling, a land of gold, opportunity, and endless sunshine. For a group of families from Springfield, Illinois, this wasn't just a dream, it was a plan. They sold their homes, packed their wagons, and joined the Great Westward Migration. This group, led by George and Jacob Donner and James Reed, would become known to history as the Donner Party. But their journey toward a golden future would descend into one of the most harrowing survival stories in American history. Their story isn't just a simple tale of horror. It's about hope, ambition, and the razor-thin line between civilization and desperation. It's a story of how a series of seemingly small mistakes can cascade into an unimaginable catastrophe. Their first fateful decision was to take a shortcut. A man named Lansford Hastings had promoted a new, faster route to California in his guidebook. A climb des Hastings cutoff would shave 300 miles off their journey. It sounded too good to be true, and as it turned out, it was. Hastings himself had barely traveled the route. The Donner Party, against the advice of experienced mountain men, decided to take the risk. This single choice sealed their fate. The shortcut was a nightmare. Instead of a smooth path, they found themselves hacking their way through dense forests and navigating treacherous, waterless deserts. Days turned into weeks, and their supplies dwindled alarmingly fast. The shortcut that was supposed to save them time had cost them a critical month. As they finally emerged from the punishing terrain, they faced their next and greatest obstacle, the Sierra Nevada mountains. It was late October. Winter had come early. Snow began to fall, lightly at first, then in a relentless, blinding blizzard. They pushed onward, desperate to cross the mountain pass before it became impassable. But they were too late. A massive snowstorm buried the trail, trapping their wagons in drifts over 10 feet deep. They were stuck, miles from any settlement, with winter closing in like a fist. The party set up a makeshift camp near a frozen lake, now known as Donner Lake. Hope began to curdle into fear. The food ran out. Their cattle, their last source of meat, were lost in the snow or starved. Hunger gnawed at them, a constant, agonizing pain. They ate twigs, boiled leather hides, and eventually the bones of their dead animals. But it wasn't enough. People started to succumb to starvation and sickness. The first to die was buried in the snow, a grim marker of their unfolding tragedy. As the days bled into weeks, the survivors faced a terrible, unthinkable choice: to live They would have to break one of society's most profound taboos. The decision was not made lightly. It was born from the deepest pit of human desperation, a choice made by parents trying to save their children, by people clinging to the slimmest thread of life. This is the part of the story that everyone remembers, but it's crucial to understand the context of unimaginable suffering that led them there. Meanwhile, a small group, later called the Forlorn Hope, set out on snowshoes to try and cross the mountains and get help. Their journey was a brutal ordeal of its own, a 33-day trek, through blizzards and over frozen landscapes. Their own tale of survival and sacrifice is an epic in itself. Against all odds, they made it to a settlement in California, launching a series of rescue attempts. The rescuers who finally reached the camp were horrified by what they found. The scenes were ghostly, the survivors barely human. It took 4 separate relief parties over 2 months to bring out the remaining survivors. Of the nearly 90 people who began the journey, only about half lived to see California. The story of the Donner Party is a chilling reminder of the fragility of human life and the dark places the mind can go when pushed to the absolute limit. It's a tragedy born from a single bad decision, a testament to the brutal power of nature, and a complex story of courage, loss, and the terrible price of survival. It serves as a stark monument on the trail of American history, reminding us of the dark roads that were traveled in the quest for a brighter future. Thanks so much for watching. If you found this story as compelling as I did, please hit that like button and subscribe for more deep dives into history's most fascinating moments. See you next time.